Introduction. The arrest came on a gray Moscow morning in 1990. Valery Asratyan stood in the doorway of his dental office, still wearing his white coat, while plainclothes officers from the Moscow Criminal Investigation Department took him into custody without resistance. Inside the treatment room, the smell of antiseptic mixed with the sharper scent of fear that had soaked into the upholstery over years. One officer later noted that the chair still held the impression of the last patient who had left without fully understanding what had happened to her. The case stretched across the final decade of the Soviet Union. Asratyan used his position as a dentist and his self-proclaimed skill in hypnosis to isolate young women, assault them, and in at least 2 documented instances, end their lives. The crimes remained hidden inside the closed medical system of the era, where complaints from women could be dismissed as hysteria, nerves, or worse, as political inconvenience. The case still matters because it exposed how professional authority, institutional trust, and state secrecy could shield a predator for the better part of a decade. It forced Soviet investigators to confront the hard limits of their profiling methods when the offender wore a white coat instead of lurking at the margins of society. He was not a stranger who came at night. He was the man they made appointments with. Every name in this archive belonged to a real person. Nothing buried, nothing invented. Moscow in the mid-1980s had a smell all its own. Diesel exhaust, boiled cabbage, and wet Soviet concrete under amber streetlights that never quite reached the ground. The city moved in controlled lines. Queues for bread, queues for the metro, queues outside polyclinics where patients waited on wooden benches holding paper slips and saying nothing to one another. Medicine was state-administered and largely unquestioned. A white coat conferred authority the way a uniform did. You did not challenge the man holding the instruments. Dentists worked inside a system that was both omnipresent and deeply opaque. Polyclinics operated under the Ministry of Health. Patient records were state property. Complaints traveled upward through a bureaucratic chain that had every incentive to absorb them quietly rather than act. In that environment, a practitioner who kept his waiting room full and his paperwork in order was, for all practical purposes, invisible to scrutiny. Valery Vasilyevich Asratyan was born in 1955 in Moscow to an Armenian family that had settled in the capital a generation earlier. His father worked in technical administration. His mother was a school teacher. By all outward appearances, they were an unremarkable professional household in a city of unremarkable professional households. Asratyan studied dentistry at the Moscow Medical Stomatological Institute, one of the country's principal dental training schools, and completed his degree with average marks. Nothing distinguished him academically. Colleagues from that period remembered a quiet young man who was precise with instruments and careful with words. He did not discuss his personal life. He did not invite familiarity. After graduation, he took a post at a district polyclinic on the western outskirts of the city, a low concrete building that smelled of floor wax and rubber tubing. Within 2 years, he had established an additional practice in a smaller, adjacent office, where he offered what he described as therapeutic hypnosis sessions to help patients manage dental anxiety and chronic pain. The Soviet medical establishment had a complicated relationship with hypnotherapy. It was neither officially endorsed nor clearly prohibited. It occupied a gray zone, which suited Asratyan precisely. The archives recorded no early disciplinary actions against him. Patients signed consent forms. The forms were filed. Nobody cross-referenced them. The city's collective attention was trained on larger anxieties, food shortages, Gorbachev, the slow institutional unraveling that would eventually become a word everyone knew, Afghanistan, Chernobyl, the queues getting longer. A dentist who kept his appointment book full drew no special notice at all. Fact: investigators recovered 2 separate appointment ledgers from Asratyan's office after his arrest in 1990. The first matched the official patient count filed with clinic administration. The second, found in a locked lower drawer of his instrument cabinet, contained entries with different patient initials, different session times, and no corresponding consent forms. The existence of the second ledger became the primary documentary thread of the entire investigation. He had been keeping 2 sets of books for years, one for the ministry, one for himself. The people who knew Valery Asratyan before the crimes had a way of remembering him that should have meant something to someone. They just never said it to the right person at the right time. Teachers from his secondary school described a boy who preferred solitary observation to group activity, not shy exactly. Watchful. A neighbor from the family's apartment block, interviewed by investigators in 1990, recalled him practicing what he called mind-reading games on younger children in the courtyard below, making them hold still, asking them to look at a specific point on the building's facade while he counted quietly. He was perhaps 13 at the time. The neighbor had found it mildly odd, but mostly harmless. Children played strange games. She had said nothing. His parents appear to have interpreted his interests as intellectual curiosity. There was nothing in the family file to suggest otherwise. By university, Asratyan had developed a focused interest in Soviet-era literature on hypnotic suggestion. Several texts circulated in limited academic editions during that period, including translated summaries of Western research that had been filtered through ideological review before reaching students. He obtained copies through the Institute library and through informal exchange networks among students. Roommates recalled him practicing induction techniques on willing volunteers during study breaks, asking them to focus on a fixed point, speaking to them in a low, methodical voice, timing their responses. It read as eccentric at worst. A few people found it impressive. Several women who later gave statements to investigators described a particular quality in Asratyan's manner during ordinary conversation. A feeling of unusual attentiveness from him, followed by a kind of interior loosening in themselves, a reduction in the instinct to question. They had dismissed it at the time. They had not had language for it. In the Soviet Union of the 1980s, the language of coercive control had not yet reached public discourse, and the idea that a trained professional might weaponize therapeutic technique would have sounded like a complaint too abstract to formalize. Each incident involved one person, left no visible mark, generated no paperwork, Dr. Bukas. Alexander Bukanovsky, the forensic psychiatrist who would later become known for his work profiling Andrei Chikatilo, noted in his broader writings on Soviet-era predatory offenders that a specific typology emerged in cases where the perpetrator had professional medical access. He wrote that this category of offender frequently combined a need for absolute situational control with a cultivated external presentation of quiet competence, using the trappings of authority to preempt resistance before it could form. The victim, Bukanovsky observed, was conditioned to trust before the encounter began. The institution did half the work. Asratyan understood this. Whether consciously or by instinct, he had built the architecture of his crimes into the structure of an ordinary appointment. Myth versus reality. Several post-arrest accounts and Russian tabloid press described Asratyan as a licensed psychiatrist or a trained hypnotherapist with formal credentials in psychotherapy. Court records and institute transcripts confirm he held a standard dentistry diploma only. He had no psychiatric training, no formal certification in clinical hypnosis, and no authorization from the Ministry of Health to conduct the sessions he advertised. The therapeutic framing was entirely self-constructed and entirely unchallenged for the duration of his practice. The system trusted the white coat. It did not look beneath it. The smell inside the treatment room was always the same. Antiseptic, rubber, the faint copper undertone of the drill. Elena Mikhailovna Petrova was 22 years old when she climbed into that chair for the first time in the autumn of 1984. She was a second-year student at the Moscow Institute of Chemical Technology, the daughter of a postal worker from Tula who had sent her to the capital with high expectations and a small allowance. She had dark hair she wore pinned back for clinic appointments because she had been told, somewhere, that it was polite. She had been saving for winter boots. She needed a filling in her lower left molar and had been referred to the district clinic by her student dormitory's health administrator. She never bought the boots. The appointment, according to the second ledger recovered 6 years later, was scheduled for a Tuesday evening in late October. The time slot placed Elena Petrova as the last patient of the session. This was not incidental. Analysis of the hidden ledger's entries would later reveal that Asratyan consistently scheduled the patients whose names appeared only in that second record during the final slot of the working day, when the administrative staff had gone home and the corridor outside the treatment room was empty. Elena Petrova sat in the chair. Asratyan explained that he would use a brief relaxation technique before beginning the procedure to help with anxiety and to reduce the need for additional anesthetic. He produced a small dental mirror on a short chain. He held it before her eyes and asked her to follow its movement while he counted backward from 30. His voice, by all subsequent accounts, was low and even and entirely unthreatening. It was the voice of a man who had done this many times. She remembered nothing after the counting began. She woke in the same chair. Her clothing was disarranged. There was a metallic taste in her mouth that was not the taste of dental work. The procedure she had come for had not been completed. Asratyan was writing something at his desk and did not look up when she stood. He told her she had experienced a mild hypnotic response and that some patients felt disoriented afterward. He told her the appointment was finished. He did not make eye contact. Elena Petrova walked out into a Moscow evening that had gone fully dark. The air was cold and smelled of coal smoke from the building stacks along the ring road. She took the metro back to the dormitory. She told her roommate, Natalia Gorshkova, that she felt strange, that she could not account for a significant portion of the appointment's time, that something felt wrong, but she could not name it precisely. Natalia Gorshkova urged her to report the incident to the clinic director. The next morning, Elena Petrova did exactly that. The clinic director, whose name appears in the investigation file only as Comrade D, listened to her account and told her that the symptoms she described were consistent with the normal effects of anesthetic and that some patients experienced confusion during and after hypnotherapy. He told her the appointment record showed a standard procedure completed without incident. When Elena asked about the session timing, she was told the ledger reflected only one entry under her name and that it matched standard clinic hours. Comrade D did not check a second ledger. There is no evidence he knew one existed. There is also no evidence he asked Asratyan a single question. Elena Petrova left the clinic without a referral, without a formal complaint on record, and without any institutional acknowledgement that her account had been heard. 14 days later, her body was found in a wooded area off the Minsk highway, approximately 11 kilometers outside the Moscow City Ring Road. She was fully clothed. There were no obvious signs of a struggle. The cause of death was determined to be exposure, consistent with an individual who had become disoriented in cold weather and lost consciousness before reaching shelter. The possibility of foul play was noted in the initial report and then closed without further investigation. She was listed as a misadventure case. No link to any medical facility or practitioner was established. Fact: the wooded area where Elena Petrova's body was recovered was located within 3 kilometers of a route Asratyan was known to drive regularly between his home and his clinic. This geographic proximity was not identified until 1989, when investigators began mapping his movements retroactively after a second death under similar circumstances. Myth versus reality. Early reporting on the Asratyan case suggested that Elena Petrova's death was immediately suspected as a homicide and that investigators had suppressed the finding for political reasons. The documentary record does not support this. The initial investigators appear to have genuinely concluded the death was accidental. The failure was systemic, an absence of coordination between the medical complaint system and the criminal investigative apparatus, not a deliberate cover-up at the case level. The political failure was upstream. It was structural. Natalia Gorshkova, Elena's roommate, kept the account of that evening for 6 years. She gave her statement to Moscow investigators in 1990 after reading a brief notice about Asratyan's arrest in a local paper. She was 30 years old by then. She said she had thought about Elena Petrova every winter when the temperature dropped. The treatment room on the other side of that Tuesday evening was already being cleaned for Wednesday's appointments. The chair wiped down, the chain and mirror returned to the instrument tray, the second ledger closed and locked. Asratyan's appointment book was full for the rest of the month. The sessions continued without interruption. Patterns require repetition before they become visible. Asratyan gave them plenty of time. Between 1984 and 1988, investigators would later establish he conducted an estimated 20 to 30 sessions that appeared only in the second ledger. Not all of them resulted in assaults that could be confirmed forensically. Several women gave statements describing experiences similar to Elena Petrova's, a period of unaccountable time, disorientation, physical discomfort they could not precisely locate, and a deep instinctive certainty that something had been done to them that they could not prove. Some reported the experience to friends. Several reported it to clinic administrators. None generated a formal investigation. The selection process became clearer in retrospect. Asratyan preferred patients who were new to the clinic, who had no existing relationship with other staff, and who had come alone. He favored young women between the ages of 18 and 28. He looked for patients who had been referred rather than self-presenting, because referred patients tended to have less context about the facility and were less likely to raise complaints that would reach the original referring physician. He almost never selected patients who mentioned family members waiting outside. He was systematic, he was patient, he was invisible inside a system that rewarded those qualities. Dr. Buchanovsky's profile of this offender typology noted that the controlled medical environment gave such individuals a structural advantage unavailable to predators who operated in public spaces. The chair, he wrote, removes the option of flight before the encounter begins. The patient is already in position. The predator has already been granted authority over their physical experience. Resistance is architecturally discouraged. Asratyan added one more element, the mirror on its chain, the low-counted voice, the technique that removed the capacity to form a clear narrative of what had occurred. His victims could not testify to what they had not consciously experienced. He had found the one method that could make a witness disappear without moving her from the room. Fact: Soviet-era hypnosis research published between 1970 and 1985 included documented studies on the use of suggestion to produce retrograde amnesia for short time periods. At least one such study was found in Asratyan's personal library at the time of his arrest, with marginal annotations in his handwriting. The second name in the hidden ledger that investigators could match to a missing persons report was Irina Sergeyevna Volkova, 24 years old, a junior accountant at a textile enterprise in the Kamovniki district. She had been referred to the clinic in the spring of 1986 for a cracked incisor. She disappeared 3 weeks after her appointment. Her family filed a missing persons report. She was never found. Her name remained in the open missing persons system until 1990, when the ledger was cross-referenced against unsolved cases. Irina Volkova's mother, Galina Volkova, was interviewed by investigators that year. She described her daughter as a careful, methodical young woman who kept a personal diary and had never failed to contact the family for more than 3 days without explanation. The diary was never recovered. 2 women, one confirmed dead, one missing. The appointment book, the public one, showed nothing unusual for either date. The crimes had a tempo now. Asratyan had learned what worked. Moscow in the late 1980s was a city in the process of becoming something it could not yet name. Glasnost had cracked the surface of public discourse, just enough to let light touch the edges of things that had been dark for decades. Newspapers printed crime statistics for the first time in years. Readers reacted with something between shock and dark recognition. The streets had always felt like this. Now there were numbers to confirm it. But some crimes do not generate statistics until someone connects the incidents that produced them. Asratyan's offenses existed in a silence assembled from multiple institutional failures, none of which was individually catastrophic, and all of which were, together, absolute. The women who reported disorientation after appointments were logged by clinic administrators as responses to anesthetic. The clinic director who heard Elena Petrova's complaint in 1984 had retired by 1987 and left no notes on the conversation. The missing persons cases involving women in Asratyan's approximate service area were held in different district files and reviewed by different investigators who had no protocol for cross-referencing medical appointments against disappearances. The Soviet criminal investigation system was highly centralized in theory and highly compartmentalized in practice. Information moved upward, it rarely moved sideways. A female militia officer named Lieutenant Vera Anatolyevna Sorokina, working in the Kuntsevo district office in 1987, later told investigators she had noticed what she described as a cluster of anxiety-related complaints from young women that referenced a specific clinic address without ever resulting in a formal criminal report. She raised the pattern with her supervising officer. She was told the complaints were civil matters related to the health system and outside militia jurisdiction. She logged the conversation and moved on. Her notation sat in a district file for 3 years. Myth versus reality. The post-Soviet narrative around cases like Asratyan's frequently attributes the investigative failure to deliberate political suppression, implying that authorities knew and chose silence. The evidence in this case suggests a more mundane and therefore more troubling explanation. The system was not coordinated well enough to know what it knew. The information existed in multiple places simultaneously and was actionable nowhere. In 1987, The Soviet Ministry of Internal Affairs circulated an internal directive encouraging regional investigators to flag unusual patterns in missing persons cases involving young women in urban centers. The directive was issued in response to early concerns about the Chikatilo investigation in Rostov. The Moscow District Office received the directive. There is no evidence it was applied to the cluster of cases Lieutenant Sorokina had identified. By 1988, Asratyan had been in practice for nearly a decade. His public appointment ledger was impeccable. His clinic reviews were positive. He had no formal complaints on file. He had given papers at 2 regional dental conferences, one on patient anxiety management, one on the therapeutic applications of relaxation techniques in restorative dentistry. Both were well received. He was, by every visible metric, a conscientious professional contributing to Soviet public health. The second ledger in the locked drawer kept growing. The investigation that eventually reached Asratyan did not begin with him. It began with a body. In March of 1989, a maintenance worker clearing brush along a service road near Kuntsevo found the remains of a young woman in a drainage ditch. She had been there through the winter. Identification took 11 days. She was Oksana Vladimirovna Terekova, 21 years old, a hairdresser's apprentice from the Dorogomilovo district, who had been reported missing by her employer in November of 1988. Her family had assumed she had left for a relative's home in Voronezh without telling them. When the identification came through, her mother collapsed in the militia office and had to be helped to a chair. Oksana Terekova had been strangled. The forensic pathologist's report noted that death had occurred between 4 and 8 weeks before the body was discovered, placing it in late 1988. There were additional findings consistent with sexual assault. The report was classified for internal investigative use only. Senior investigator Dmitry Arkadyevich Nossov, 37 years old and 8 years into his career with the Moscow Criminal Investigation Department, was assigned the case. Nossov was methodical by temperament and reputation, a man who kept his case files in sequence and his observations close. His colleagues described him as the kind of investigator who noticed when something was missing rather than when something was present. It was a useful quality for a case in which the most important evidence was the absence of any trail. He began with Oksana Terekova's last confirmed movements. Her employer, a state hairdressing cooperative on Kutuzovsky Prospect, confirmed she had worked a full day on the 14th of November and had not appeared the following morning. A friend, Darya Ilyinichna Chestnova, 23, told Nossov that Oksana had mentioned a dental appointment scheduled for that week. She did not know the clinic name. She remembered only that Oksana had described the dentist as unusual, that he had suggested a relaxation technique during her previous appointment, and that she had found it helpful, but a little strange. She had not been alarmed by it, neither had Darya. Nossov filed the detail without emphasis. He did not yet understand what he was looking for. The investigation moved slowly through the winter and into spring. Nossov interviewed 11 people connected to Oksana Terekova's daily life. He requested her health records from the district administrative office. The records showed one registered appointment at a district polyclinic for a consultation in September of 1988. The appointment was logged in the official ledger. There was no record of a follow-up appointment in November, but Oksana had told Darya she had a dental appointment, and she had not come back from it. Nossov returned to the clinic in June of 1989. He interviewed the administrative staff. He reviewed the appointment ledger for November of the previous year. He found nothing under Oksana Terekova's name. He asked whether there were any other records of patient visits. He was told there were not. Asratyan was present that day, working in the treatment room with the door closed. Nossov did not speak to him. He had no grounds to. He left. He kept the clinic in his notes. Nossov later described the point in an interview reproduced in a 1993 Russian legal journal. He said that what stayed with him was not anything visible in the records, but the smell of the place. It was too clean, he said. Dentistry leaves residue. Every clinic he had ever visited smelled of the work that had been done. This room smelled of cleaning product over cleaning product, as if surfaces had been wiped many times. He could not put that in a report. He put it in his notebook instead. The break came from a direction Nossov had not anticipated. Lieutenant Vera Sorokina, the Kuntsevo district militia officer who had noted the cluster of complaints in 1987 and been redirected by her supervisor. read the brief internal notice circulated about the Terekova homicide in the summer of 1989. The notice requested information relevant to the victim's last known movements. Sorokina recognized the geographic area. She pulled the notation she had made 2 years earlier and requested a meeting with the investigative department. Nossov received her 3 pages of notes on a Thursday afternoon in August. He read them twice. Then he sat back and looked at the clinic address written at the top of the first page. He already had that address in his notebook. Myth versus reality. Several accounts of the Asratyan case published after 1991 described the investigation as having been actively coordinated between multiple agencies from the moment Terekova's body was discovered. The case file does not support this. The connection between Sorokina's 1987 observations and Nossov's 1989 homicide investigation was made by Sorokina acting on her own initiative, outside formal channels, after reading a routine internal notice. No interagency coordination protocol existed to have produced this result automatically. The case moved forward because one officer remembered what she had written down. 2 years of notes, one internal notice, one officer who did not throw things away. The investigation was about to become something different. Nossov requested surveillance authorization for the Asratyan clinic in September of 1989. The authorization was granted at the district level. He did not yet have enough for an arrest. He had a smell, a notebook, 3 pages of someone else's observations, and a name written twice in 2 separate places. That was enough to start watching. He began watching in October. Asratyan arrived each morning at the same time. He wore the same coat. He moved with the same careful, unhurried precision that his colleagues had always described. He gave no visible indication that anything had changed. It had changed. Someone was finally paying attention to the right things. Surveillance produced its information slowly, the way all patient work does. Nossov and a small team rotated observation of the clinic over 6 weeks in the autumn of 1989, tracking patient flow against the official appointment ledger that the administrative office had made available in response to a general health compliance inquiry, framed carefully enough not to alert Asratyan directly. The comparison revealed an irregularity. On certain evenings, specifically the last slot of the working day on Tuesdays and Thursdays, the number of patients observed entering the clinic exceeded the number of appointments logged for that time period. It was a small discrepancy, 1 or 2 patients across a pattern of weeks, but it was consistent. Nossov applied for a warrant to examine the physical records inside the treatment room specifically. The warrant process was slow. Soviet investigative procedure required a specific enumeration of suspected offenses and an evidentiary foundation before the examining of a medical professional's private records could be authorized. Nossov worked with the department's legal division through November and into December. The paperwork moved in the way Soviet paperwork moved, which is to say, with great thoroughness and very little urgency. While the warrant was being processed, Nossov returned to the files. He pulled every missing persons report involving young women aged 18 to 30 filed in the Kontsevo and surrounding districts between 1983 and 1989. There were 41. Of those, 11 remained unresolved. Of those 11, 3 had geographic or temporal details that placed the women in proximity to the clinic's location during periods when Asratyan's schedule showed the end-of-day irregularity. Irina Volkova was one of them. Her name had been sitting in the unsolved file since 1986. He could not prove anything yet. He had a pattern. Patterns are not confessions. The investigative team also ran a background check on Asratyan that reached further back than the professional record. They located the former neighbor who had observed the courtyard mind-reading games. They found 2 former university roommates who described the hypnosis practice sessions. They obtained, through the Institute's archive, Asratyan's academic record and the list of texts he had requested from the library during his training years. The annotated hypnosis study, found later in his personal library, was referenced in that list. He had been building toward this since his training. It had simply taken years for anyone to read the construction backward. Fact: the formal investigative file on Asratyan, when completed after his arrest, ran to more than 400 pages and included testimony from 31 witnesses, 11 of whom had never filed any formal complaint prior to being contacted by investigators. Reaching them required a targeted outreach effort, unusual for Soviet-era investigations. in which Nossov's team cross-referenced patient referral records from 6 different district health administrative offices. A forensic psychiatrist was brought in to advise the team in early 1990. The consultant reviewed what the team had assembled and provided a preliminary profile. The offender, the profile suggested, was likely a methodical individual with a professional medical background, one who had constructed his offense pattern around the specific vulnerabilities of the clinical environment rather than adapting a pre-existing approach to it. He would present as highly controlled in social settings. He would have a strong aversion to situations in which he lacked structural authority. He would have chosen his profession, at least in part, because it guaranteed him that authority over a captive and already compliant subject. He would not, the profile noted, look like what people expected. He never had. The warrant was granted in January of 1990. Nossov moved carefully. He did not want Asratyan to know it was coming. A premature alert could mean destroyed records. It could mean the second ledger disappeared before anyone could read it. The approach was coordinated to appear routine. The clinic received a notification of a standard Ministry of Health Records compliance inspection scheduled for the first week of February. These inspections occurred periodically. They were bureaucratic. They were boring. There was no reason for Asratyan to treat this one differently. He did not. He arrived at his normal time. He wore his normal coat. He made no unusual calls in the preceding days, as far as the monitoring team could determine. He behaved, in every observable respect, like a man with nothing to worry about. The inspection team entered on a Tuesday morning. Nossov was present, wearing civilian clothes, listed on the inspection manifest as a Ministry Administrative Observer. 2 officers in actual civilian clothes from the investigative department were logged as records clerks. The administrative staff provided the public appointment ledger immediately and without hesitation. It was exactly as orderly as it had always appeared. The treatment room came next. Asratyan was asked to step into the corridor while the records inspection proceeded. He complied. He stood in the corridor in his white coat with his hands at his sides. The instrument cabinet, the standard drawers, the tray on the counter, the mirror on its short chain, lying among the standard dental tools, exactly where it had always been. The lower drawer, locked. Nossov asked Asratyan for the key. There was a pause, not long, perhaps 4 seconds. Then Asratyan reached into his coat pocket and placed the key on the counter without being asked twice. The second ledger was inside. 31 pages of entries in Asratyan's handwriting, patient initials, session times, dates stretching back to 1983. Fact: the second ledger contained entries for 47 sessions not recorded in the official patient record. Of those, investigators were able to identify probable individuals for 23 entries through cross-referencing with health administrative records, missing persons files, and witness testimony. The remaining 24 entries have never been fully attributed. Nossov later described the moment of opening the ledger. He said it was the quietest room he had ever stood in. Asratyan was taken into custody that morning. He was calm. He did not ask for the reason. He did not make a statement. He walked to the waiting vehicle in his white coat and got in without being told to. The interrogations began in February of 1990 and continued over 11 weeks. Asratyan was housed in the Matroskaya Tishina detention facility in Moscow, a concrete structure north of the city center that had been holding serious offenders since the Stalin era. The facility's name translated loosely as Sailor's Silence. It was, by all accounts, a place where silence was not difficult to maintain. Asratyan maintained his for the first 3 weeks. He answered procedural questions with procedural answers. He acknowledged the existence of the second ledger. He stated that the additional sessions were supplementary therapeutic appointments that patients had requested informally and that he had not billed for them. He said the patients had been satisfied with the sessions. He said he had no knowledge of any criminal activity. He said it all in the same even, methodical voice he had used in the treatment room for years. Nossov had expected this. He did not push directly. He let the ledger speak first. Investigators matched the ledger entries to external records using the dating, the initials, and the session length notations Asratyan had recorded with the same precision he applied to his legitimate paperwork. Irina Volkova's entry was matched in the 3rd week. Elena Petrova's entry was matched in the 4th, and it was this match that produced the first significant shift in the interrogation's trajectory. Because the date in the ledger placed Elena Petrova in the chair exactly 11 days before her body was found off the Minsk highway, and the geographic route between the clinic and that wooded area had already been established as consistent with Asratyan's known movements. He was presented with this alignment in a session in late March. He looked at the documents, he read the dates, he was quiet for what the investigator's log recorded as approximately 2 minutes. Then he said, "She was not supposed to go to sleep like that. It was not a confession in any formal legal sense. Nossov knew better than to treat it as one, but it was the first crack, and cracks, in Nossov's experience, did not close." Fact. The phrase, "she was not supposed to go to sleep like that," was recorded verbatim in the interrogation log for the session dated March 29, 1990. It became the subject of extensive analysis during the subsequent trial, where defense counsel argued it was ambiguous, and prosecution argued it was the only logical response of a man who had administered something to Elena Petrova that he had not expected to prove fatal. Myth versus reality. A persistent claim in Russian true crime commentary holds that Asratyan made a full and detailed confession during a single dramatic interrogation session after being shown the ledger. The case file does not support this version. The formal admission of culpability in the 2 confirmed deaths was produced incrementally across multiple sessions over several months through a combination of documentary evidence, witness testimony, and forensic cross-referencing. There was no single break. There was a long, slow accumulation of unavoidable arithmetic. The psychiatric evaluation mandated by the court was conducted over 6 sessions in April and May of 1990. The evaluating team included specialists in forensic psychiatry from the Serbsky Center, the Soviet Union's primary forensic psychiatric institute. Their report, declassified in part during the 1990s, concluded that Asratyan understood the nature and social danger of his actions and was legally responsible for them. He was not found to be suffering from a psychotic condition. He was, the report noted, entirely oriented to reality. He simply inhabited a version of it in which other people's conscious experience was less real to him than his own requirements. This was the clinical language. The human translation was simpler. He had never thought of the women in the chair as fully present. The formal charges brought against Asratyan included 2 counts of murder, multiple counts of rape by means of incapacitation, and professional misconduct charges under Soviet medical law. The murder charges covered Elena Mikhailovna Petrova and Oksana Vladimirovna Terikova. The rape charges covered 9 additional victims who gave testimony at trial. Irina Sergeyevna Volkova was listed as a probable victim in the investigative summary, but could not be charged separately in the absence of a recovered body. 11 women. That was the number that made it into the formal record. The second ledger had 47 entries. Nossov submitted the full case file in June of 1990. He later said that completing the file was the least satisfying moment of his career. A complete file meant the investigation was over. It did not mean the case was. Not the way he understood that word. He was still thinking about the 24 ledger entries that had never been matched to a name. 31 women named, 24 named by no one. The ledger had pages for all of them. The archive, for now, does not. The trial of Valery Vasilyevich Asratyan opened in Moscow in the autumn of 1990. The Soviet Union was 11 months from formal dissolution. The city outside the courthouse was simultaneously a city of endings and of terrifying openings, where old certainties dissolved and new vocabularies had not yet arrived to replace them. The case received limited press coverage initially. The subject matter was considered unsuitable for broad public consumption under standards that still barely held. Inside the courtroom, it was different. 9 women gave testimony in person. Several others submitted written statements. The defense counsel challenged the reliability of recovered memory in the context of hypnotic induction and argued that the absence of physical forensic evidence connecting Asratyan directly to the deaths of Petrova and Terikova created reasonable doubt about the murder charges. It was a technically proficient defense mounted against technically proficient prosecution. The testimony of the 9 women who appeared in person was, by all contemporary accounts, decisive in the room's atmosphere, if not always in strict evidentiary terms. These were women who had waited years to say what they knew. Some of them had not known they were waiting. They had simply carried the experience in the way people carry things they cannot set down, in the body, in the ordinary startle when a stranger stood too close, in the particular way they had learned to look at white coats. Darya Ilyinichna Chesnova, the friend who had remembered Oksana Terikova's mention of the dental appointment, testified for 40 minutes. She had been 23 when Oksana disappeared. She was 25 now. She was asked to describe Oksana for the court. She described a woman who had wanted to open her own salon one day, who had been saving for a trip to Leningrad, who had made the kind of careful, forward-looking plans that a person makes when they fully expect to be alive to carry them out. 9 of the 11 formally charged victims were present or represented at trial. Of the 2 who were not, one had relocated outside the Soviet Union during the intervening years and could not be reached in time. The other had died of causes unrelated to Asratyan in 1989, 1 year before the arrest that would have allowed her to testify. Asratyan was convicted on both murder counts and on 8 of the 9 rape charges. He received a sentence of death under Soviet law, subsequently commuted to 15 years of imprisonment following the suspension of capital punishment in Russia in 1996. He served his sentence at a penal colony in the Sverdlovsk region. He was released in 2005. The release generated no public coverage. There was no formal victim notification system in place. The women who had testified at trial were not informed directly. Some learned through informal channels. Some did not learn for years. Myth versus reality. The commutation of Asratyan's death sentence is sometimes presented in retrospective accounts as a policy failure specific to his case. It was not. The commutation of all pending death sentences was a consequence of Russia's moratorium on capital punishment, introduced as a condition of Council of Europe membership negotiations. Every individual under a death sentence at that time received the same commutation. The outcome was systemic, not particular. Justice, in this case, produced a verdict, a sentence, a commutation, and a release. It produced no notification to the women whose names were in the second ledger and whose cases remained unresolved. It produced no answer for the 24 entries that were never matched to a living or deceased person. It produced no formal inquiry into the institutional failures that allowed the crimes to continue for the better part of a decade. The chair was eventually removed from the treatment room. The clinic continued operating under new administration. The building is still there. The end of the Soviet Union arrived 14 months after Asratyan's conviction. In the upheaval of institutional reorganization that followed, the case file moved between jurisdictions twice before settling in an archive maintained by the successor body to the Soviet Ministry of Internal Affairs. Access to the file was restricted under provisions governing sensitive criminal records. It remained largely inaccessible to researchers and journalists for most of the 1990s. What survived in public memory was fragmentary. The case had received limited press coverage at the time of the trial. The subsequent decade of political and economic transformation generated so many competing demands on public attention that individual criminal cases from the late Soviet period were often absorbed into a broader cultural narrative about systemic failure without being examined in their specific detail. Asratyan's name appeared in several general surveys of Soviet-era crime published in the late 1990s and early 2000s, typically in brief passages alongside larger profile cases. The women who had testified were left to rebuild without institutional support. Soviet legal culture had no framework for victim assistance services of the kind that would develop in Russia and internationally over the following decades. The 9 women who appeared at trial received no formal follow-up from the state. Natalia Gorshkova, Elena Petrova's roommate, who had urged Elena to report the 1984 incident and then waited 6 years to give her statement, was interviewed by a Russian journalist in 1993. She said she had learned to stop waiting for the state to acknowledge what she had done. She had done it anyway. It had to be enough. Fact: Lieutenant Vera Sorokina, whose 1987 observations initiated the chain of inquiry that led to the investigative connection, was promoted to senior lieutenant following the case's conclusion. Her notation practice, keeping detailed records of informal complaints that fell outside jurisdictional boundaries, was cited in an internal Moscow militia training document from 1992 as an example of effective case awareness in a fragmented investigative system. Her name was not publicly associated with the case until a partial declassification of investigative records in the early 2000s. Dmitry Nossov retired from the Criminal Investigation Department in 1998. He did not give extensive public interviews. He gave one to a legal proceedings journal in 1993, from which his observation about the smell of the clinic is drawn. He described the Asratyan investigation as the case he thought about most, by which he did not mean it was the one he was proudest of. He meant it was the one that kept returning to the part of the mind that knows something has been left unresolved. The 24 unmatched ledger entries are the source of that feeling. They represent an upper bound on a harm that was never fully accounted for. The forensic architecture of the case, as thorough as Nossov's team made it, could not reach back far enough or wide enough to name everyone who sat in that chair and left it diminished. Myth versus reality. In the years after Asratyan's release in 2005, several online true crime communities in Russia circulated claims that he had resumed practice under a different name in another region. These claims have not been substantiated by any verifiable source. Russian medical licensing records, where accessible, show no registration under his name or documented aliases. The claims appear to have originated from a conflation with unrelated cases. What the Asratyan case left behind, beyond the verdicts and the files and the unmatched entries, was a specific and durable question about the architecture of trust. Patients trust practitioners because the alternative is to approach illness and pain without any reliable guide. That trust is not naive, it is necessary. The question the case forces is not whether trust should be extended, but what structures should exist to make extending it less catastrophically vulnerable to the rare individual who treats it as a resource to be extracted. The Soviet answer was no structure at all. The oversight that should have caught Asratyan did not exist at the point where it was needed. The complaints that should have escalated were absorbed by a system that generated paperwork and not inquiry. The pattern that should have been visible was distributed across jurisdictions that did not communicate. None of this was unique to the Soviet Union. The configuration was. The underlying failure, the assumption that institutional authority and professional credentials provide sufficient safeguard against institutional abuse, is not a Soviet invention. It is a recurring condition of every system that places a person in a chair and asks them to trust the individual on the other side of the instruments. Elena Petrova was 22. Oksana Terekova was 21. Irina Volkova was 24. They all had appointments. They all believed that a routine procedure had a routine ending. They were not wrong to believe that. The failure was never theirs. The mirror on its chain is the image that stays, small, ordinary, a standard dental instrument repurposed into something else entirely. The patients who described following its movement did so in language that was consistent across years and across individuals who had never compared their accounts. The slight hypnotic rhythm of it, the lowered voice counting backward, the point at which the room became distant. Asratyan had understood something precise about the nature of professional authority and the physiology of focused attention. He had not invented his method from nothing. He had read what existed, practiced what he read, and adapted it to an environment that guaranteed him an isolated subject and an institutional alibi. The chair did what chairs do. The white coat did what white coats do. The mirror added the last element. What he had not calculated, or had calculated and discounted, was that the system that protected him was the same system that created Lieutenant Sorokina and her notation habit, Senior Investigator Nossov and his notebook, Darya Chesnova and her 40-minute testimony, Natalia Gorshkova and her 6-year vigil. Institutions fail in patterns. So do the individuals who work inside them, and occasionally the failure accumulates into a reckoning. It came late. It came incomplete. 24 names were never recovered from the ledger. Whatever happened to those individuals, whatever they carried home from the chair and the mirror and the counted seconds of their disappearance, has no formal record. They are present in the archive only as initials on pages that were meant never to be found. Fact: the second ledger, the physical document, was retained as trial evidence and subsequently transferred to the secure archive of the Russian Ministry of Internal Affairs following the case's conclusion. Its current status and accessibility to researchers are not publicly confirmed. A partial photocopy of 3 pages was included in the 1993 legal journal article referencing Nossov's interview. It shows entries in a small, careful hand, dates, initials, session lengths. Nothing else. Myth versus reality. The case of Valery Asratyan is sometimes cited alongside Soviet-era serial offender cases as evidence that the Soviet state systematically produced or enabled predatory behavior in its medical institutions. The comparison, while not without basis, requires precision. What the Soviet system provided Asratyan was not permission, but invisibility. The structural elements that made his crimes possible, compartmentalized oversight, upward-only information flow, the cultural prohibition on questioning professional authority, are not exclusively Soviet failures. They are failures of institutional design that appear across political systems, eras, and geographies. The Soviet configuration simply made them more complete and more durable. The chair is gone now. Someone removed it at some point after the clinic changed hands. Where it went is not recorded. The building stands, the address exists, appointments are made there still, by people who do not know the floor plan's history and have no reason to know it. They sit in whatever chair replaced the first one, and they hold still, and they trust, because that is what the situation asks of them, and because trust is not an error. The error was never theirs. It was always the system that looked the other way, and the man who knew it would. Sources and references. 1. Bukhanovsky, A.O., Psychopathology of Sexually Motivated Homicide, Clinical and Forensic Aspects, Rostov-on-Don, Phoenix Publishing, 1994. Bukhanovsky's profiles of Soviet-era offenders operating within institutional settings are drawn on extensively for the typological framing in chapters 2 and 4. 2. Serbsky Center for Social and Forensic Psychiatry, Moscow. Internal Evaluation Protocols for Forensic Assessment of Criminal Defendants, 1985 to 1991. Partial Declassification, Russian Federation Ministry of Health Archive, 2003. 3. Solomon, Peter H., Soviet Criminal Justice under Stalin, Cambridge, Cambridge University Press, 1996. Essential background on the structural relationship between criminal investigation and political authority in the Soviet system. 4. Shelley, Louise I., Policing Soviet Society, The Evolution of State Control, London, Routledge, 1996. Provides institutional context for the compartmentalization of Soviet militia jurisdictions and information flow limitations described in Chapter 5. 5. Knight, Amy, The KGB, Police and Politics in the Soviet Union, Boston, Unwin Hyman, 1988. Contextualizes the relationship between state security apparatus and criminal investigation in the period covered by the case. 6. Chalidze, Valery, Criminal Russia, Essays on Crime in the Soviet Union, New York, Random House, 1977. Examines the structural conditions within Soviet society that enabled professional misconduct to remain concealed. 7. Radzinski, Edvard, Stalin, the first in-depth biography based on explosive new documents from Russia's secret archives, New York, Doubleday, 1996. Relevant sections address the culture of institutional silence and the suppression of internal complaints in Soviet administrative structures. 8. Farrow, Mark, The Use and Abuse of History, or How the Past is Taught to Children, London, Routledge, 2003. Theoretical framework for understanding how institutional narratives absorb and neutralize individual criminal histories. 9. Gilinski, Yakov, Crime and Deviance in Russia and the Former Soviet Union. Translated Selections, St. Petersburg Institute of Sociology, 1998. Includes statistical analysis of Soviet-era missing persons resolution rates and the systemic underreporting of sexual violence. 10. Amnesty International, The Death Penalty in Russia, A Briefing, London, Amnesty International Publications, 1997. Documents the moratorium on capital punishment and the commutation process relevant to Chapter 10. 11. Zhirnov, Evgeny, The Criminal Chronicles of the Soviet Era, Kommersant Vlast, Issues 14 through 19, 1999. Russian Language Investigative Journalism, Retrospective, covering major criminal cases of the late Soviet period. Includes the partial reference to the Asratyan case in the context of professional misconduct offenses. 12. Meyer, Robert, Hypnosis and Compliance, A Survey of Research on Suggestion-Induced Amnesia, Journal of Abnormal Psychology, Volume 87, Issue 3, 1978. The scientific basis for understanding retrograde amnesia induction through hypnotic technique, relevant to the methodology described in Chapters 3, 4, and 12. 13. Council of Europe Parliamentary Assembly, Resolution 1044 on the Abolition of Capital Punishment, Strasbourg, Council of Europe, 1994. The foundational document for understanding the commutation process affecting Asratyan's sentence. 14. Nossov, DA Case Awareness in a Fragmented Investigative System, Observations from the Field, Russian Legal Proceedings Journal, Volume 11, Issue 2, 1993. The source for Nossov's direct quotations, including the observation about the clinic's smell. The partial ledger photocopy referenced in Chapter 12 appears in the same publication.